Welcome to my philosophy channel. This video may be long, but if you stay until the end, you may finally understand why humans cannot understand themselves, why every single behavior is driven by hidden forces, and why the deep trauma we desperately try to ignore never truly disappears. We will explore the darkest architecture of human consciousness and uncover the hidden truths ruling us. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Rationality. We mistake the tiny illuminated stage of our consciousness for the entire vast theater of the mind. Have you ever seriously wondered why a perfectly gentle person might suddenly erupt into terrifying anger without any warning? Perhaps you have witnessed a seemingly optimistic individual experience, a complete emotional collapse in the middle of the night. We desperately want to believe that these frightening moments are meaningless anomalies. We constantly tell ourselves that the painful past has been left behind completely. Yet, in certain specific moments, those buried memories emerge like vengeful ghosts to seize total control of our present reality. They dictate our spontaneous words, manipulate our emotional reactions, and ultimately reroute the entire trajectory of our unsuspecting lives. We desperately attempt to rationalize these strange behaviors, claiming they lack any logical foundation. Unfortunately, the deepest human core has never cared about rational logic. The true engine driving our daily existence is not the calm rationality we so arrogantly proudly claim to possess. Instead, we are relentlessly propelled by secret urges and hidden desires buried deep beneath the surface of our awareness. We walk through modern society wearing heavy masks of absolute control, completely oblivious to the raging psychological storms churning violently within our own ignored unconscious depths. How can we ever hope to truly recognize ourselves when we refuse to look into the darkness? Sigmund Freud was the first courageous explorer to deliberately unlock this terrifying door into the mental wilderness. While other philosophers pondered the conscious intellect, he bravely stepped into the endless night of the unconscious mind, attempting to map the invisible forces that quietly dictate every human decision. He brilliantly compared the structure of the human mind to a colossal iceberg drifting through a freezing ocean. The tiny fragment peeking above the water represents our daily rationality and conscious awareness. However, the vast, terrifying, and overwhelmingly powerful mass hidden beneath the dark waves represents the unconscious. That submerged mountain of suppressed memories holds the absolute ultimate power over our destiny. Within this submerged darkness lie the chaotic impulses, the forbidden desires, and the traumatic experiences we desperately wish to erase. These invisible elements constitute the true invisible masters of our daily actions. We believe we are making free choices every single day, choosing our partners, our careers, and our convictions. In reality, our surface intellect is merely justifying the decisions already made below. During the late 19th century, European society was utterly consumed by a profound belief in reason and religious morality. Freud completely shattered this comforting illusion by revealing that human behavior is rarely the product of pious morality. Instead, he argued that even the most proper citizens are secretly governed by intense inner conflicts that constantly threaten to tear their carefully constructed worlds apart. We are not the sovereign kings of our own castles. Our minds are perpetual battlegrounds where forgotten childhood wounds constantly wage secret wars against modern social expectations. When these colossal subterranean energies are denied expression, they mutate into devastating psychological symptoms like severe anxiety, crippling phobias, or sudden hysteria. The mind will always find a twisted way to speak its most painful truths. Freud did not merely write medical textbooks. He initiated a radical revolution in how humanity perceives its own existence. He forced a proud civilization to admit that its most noble achievements were often driven by suppressed primal urges. We must accept that the inner void exists before we can ever attempt to bridge it. Healing requires us to surrender our fictional supremacy over ourselves. The light of reason means nothing if it absolutely refuses to acknowledge the surrounding darkness. Time does not heal psychological wounds. It merely buries them deeper into the unforgiving soil of the mind. Chapter 2. The Weight of the Invisible Past. We are constantly comforted by the famous adage that time heals all wounds. Yet Freud discovered that the human unconscious is completely devoid of any concept of time. A terrifying event that occurred 20 years ago remains just as vivid and potent within the deepest layers of the mind, as if it happened yesterday. Time merely hides the pain. When we experience a psychological shock too massive for our fragile conscious mind to process, a terrifying survival mechanism engages. This invisible guardian is known as repression. Rather than allowing the mind to completely fracture under the unbearable weight of anguish, repression violently shoves the traumatic memory down into the pitch-black abyss of the unconscious. This act of psychological amputation provides us with a magnificent but incredibly dangerous illusion. We delude ourselves into believing we have successfully moved on from the tragedy because we can no longer actively recall the specific details. However, repression is never a complete deletion. It is merely a relocation of highly volatile and extremely dangerous emotional energy. The ultimate battlefield, where these devastating repressions first take root, is the highly vulnerable landscape of early childhood. A child does not possess the rational armor required to defend against cruelty, abandonment, or severe neglect. Every single act of parental rejection or sudden terror is magnified into an absolute existential crisis and swiftly buried to ensure immediate survival. What happens to these buried wounds when the child eventually evolves into an adult? They do not rest peacefully in their subterranean graves. Instead, they actively mutate into invisible magnets, relentlessly pulling the unsuspecting individual toward the exact same types of painful scenarios. Freud identified this terrifying cycle as the unforgiving phenomenon of repetition compulsion. Consider the individual who desperately desires love, but consistently chooses romantic partners who utterly betray them. They mourn their terrible luck and blame a cruel universe for their suffering. In brutal reality, their own unconscious mind is meticulously orchestrating the tragedy, desperately attempting to recreate the familiar dynamics of an unresolved childhood wound to finally master it. When the pressure of these repressed emotions reaches a critical breaking point, the mind generates devastating symptoms. That sudden panic attack during a normal meeting or that unexplainable phobia plaguing your everyday life are not random neurological glitches. They are the desperate, muffled screams of the repressed trauma desperately trying to shatter the heavy concrete of your consciousness. Freud recognized that attempting to cure these deep symptoms with superficial logic was an absolute exercise in futility. The only genuine path to liberation requires a terrifying descent back into the pitch-black abyss. We must courageously drag the suppressed horrors out of the shadows and into the forgiving light of conscious awareness to finally strip away their power. We can never outrun the invisible ghosts that reside permanently within our own shadows. Sleep does not bring absolute peace, it merely opens the door to a different kind of battlefield. Chapter 3. The Royal Road to the Unconscious. We spend nearly a third of our entire lives suspended in the mysterious realm of sleep. Modern science often attempts to dismiss our bizarre dreams as mere biological static or meaningless neurological discharges. However, Freud vehemently rejected this shallow interpretation, believing that every single dream served a profound psychological purpose. He famously declared that dreams are the royal road to understanding the deepest activities of the unconscious mind. When we are awake, our conscious mind maintains a relentless and exhausting surveillance over our inappropriate desires. We constantly suppress unacceptable urges to maintain a civilized facade. But when we finally fall asleep, this internal security guard momentarily relaxes its strict vigilance. During this crucial period of diminished control, our deepest and most forbidden desires sneak out from the shadows, desperately seeking a temporary form of psychological fulfillment. Yet, even in sleep, our internal censorship system is never completely inactive. If a dream presented our raw, taboo desires too explicitly, the shock would instantly wake us up in absolute terror. Therefore, the mind employs a brilliant strategy of camouflage to bypass the remaining mental checkpoints. It meticulously disguises our true wishes by transforming them into confusing symbols, bizarre scenarios, and seemingly incomprehensible abstract metaphors. Freud brilliantly divided every dream into two distinct architectural layers. The manifest content is the absurd movie you actually experience and remember upon waking, filled with strange characters and illogical events. The latent content, however, is the true, hidden meaning, buried beneath the bizarre imagery. To truly understand a dream, we must become psychological detectives, carefully decoding the superficial illusion to uncover the secret urge pulsing beneath. But what about terrifying nightmares that leave us covered in a cold sweat? How could a frightening scenario possibly represent a hidden wish? Freud argued that nightmares often occur when the disguise fails and a suppressed desire threatens to erupt into awareness. The extreme anxiety experienced during a nightmare is the panicked reaction of the ego, defending itself against an overwhelming and unacceptable inner truth. The ultimate function of this nightly theater is to protect our crucial sleep while simultaneously venting volatile psychological pressure. By allowing our unconscious mind to express its suppressed desires through safe symbolic fantasies, we prevent these explosive energies from overwhelming our waking lives. Our dreams are intricate masterpieces of psychological engineering, meticulously designed to maintain our fragile sanity in a world that demands constant and unforgiving self-control. The darkest secrets of the soul are whispered only when the world is finally silent. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Inner Conflict. We are never truly alone because we are constantly accompanied by the endless arguments occurring within our own minds. We falsely believe that we possess a singular, unified personality making clear and rational decisions. However, Freud brilliantly deconstructed this grand illusion by revealing that the human mind is actually divided into three distinct and constantly warring factions. You are not a single entity. You are an exhausting psychological battlefield. At the absolute bottom of this psychological hierarchy exists a terrifying and primal force known as the id. This is the original, unfiltered core of our biological identity, completely unbothered by societal rules, logic, or basic morality. The id operates exclusively upon the relentless pleasure principle, screaming for immediate gratification of every single biological urge and dark desire, regardless of the potential catastrophic consequences to our waking lives. Imagine a newborn infant crying desperately in the middle of the night. The infant does not care about the exhaustion of the parents or the demands of the external world. It operates entirely from the core of the id, demanding absolute comfort and complete satisfaction without compromise. Even as mature adults, this savage infant remains buried deep within us, continuously demanding impossible pleasures without any consideration for reality. Standing in direct and violent opposition to this primal chaos is the punishing architect, known as the superego. This element represents the strict internalization of societal expectations, parental demands, and absolute moral perfectionism. The superego functions as a ruthless internal judge, constantly monitoring your every thought and punishing you with crushing waves of guilt whenever you even subconsciously consider submitting to the forbidden desires of the primal id. The superego is not your authentic voice, yet it disguises itself brilliantly as your conscience. It is woven from the countless scoldings you received during childhood and the impossible standards glorified by modern culture. It constantly whispers that you are never quite good enough, never working hard enough, and never virtuous enough. This relentless internal interrogation creates a paralyzing perfectionism that silently destroys your capacity for genuine human joy. Caught directly between these two unforgiving extremes is the conscious self, scientifically identified as the ego. The ego operates upon the reality principle, desperately attempting to mediate the relentless demands of the savage id and the crushing moral judgments of the superego. It is the exhausted diplomat, constantly negotiating impossible psychological compromises just to ensure that you can successfully function within a civilized modern society without experiencing total breakdown. This constant psychological negotiation requires an absolutely immense expenditure of internal energy. When you return home from a routine day of work, feeling utterly devastated and profoundly drained, you are not merely suffering from physical fatigue. You are experiencing the severe depletion of the ego after spending 8 hours desperately suppressing your true urges while simultaneously defending against the harsh criticisms generated by your own unforgiving superego. Whenever this delicate internal negotiation completely fails, we experience a terrifying phenomenon known as psychological anxiety. This intense discomfort is simply an internal warning signal proving that the savage id is threatening to overpower the rational defenses of the ego. To prevent complete conscious disintegration, the exhausted ego rapidly deploys an arsenal of invisible psychological defense mechanisms to safely distort, repress, or redirect these extremely dangerous internal energies. Consider how often we utilize the mechanism of projection to survive our own internal shame. When we secretly harbor deeply inappropriate aggression or forbidden desires, the ego brilliantly defends our self-esteem by convincing us that other people actually possess those exact same flaws. We aggressively attack and condemn in others the very shadows that we absolutely refuse to acknowledge and accept within the darkest corners of our souls. Another highly effective defense deployed by the desperate ego is the art of rationalization. When we fail to achieve a deeply desired goal, or when we commit a morally questionable act, we instantly construct elaborate and logical explanations to justify our behavior. We lie brilliantly to ourselves under the guise of pure reason, never admitting that we were actually driven by blind envy, primal fear, or unchecked greed. Perhaps the most bizarre and fascinating psychological defense is known as reaction formation. When an unconscious desire terrifies the ego completely, we overcompensate by fiercely adopting the exact opposite belief in our conscious lives. The individual who preaches most aggressively against moral corruption is often desperately attempting to suppress their own, intensely powerful urges toward that exact same corruption. Absolute zealousness is frequently a desperate mask for secret temptation. We also frequently employ displacement to safely vent our suppressed and volatile emotional pressure. If you are unfairly reprimanded by a powerful boss at work, the primal id demands immediate and violent retribution. However, the rational ego understands that striking your employer will destroy your livelihood. Therefore, you safely redirect that burning fury downward, returning home to unjustly yell at your defenseless spouse or kick the family pet. Not all defense mechanisms are inherently destructive or maladaptive. Freud believed that sublimation was the highest form of psychological redirection and the true foundation of all human civilization. When we successfully channel the dangerous, unacceptable energies of the id into highly productive and socially appreciated creative outlets, we sublimate our chaos. Magnificent art, monumental architecture, and astounding scientific breakthroughs are often beautiful disguises for primal sexual or aggressive frustrations. In our modern digital era, this tripartite war has become exponentially more intense and devastating. Social media platforms act as massive synthetic extensions of both the primal id and the punishing superego. We are constantly bombarded with infinite temptations designed exclusively to stimulate our most base biological desires, while simultaneously being judged against impossible curated standards of flawless perfection cultivated by society. The fragile ego is entirely under siege. We scroll endlessly through glowing screens, trapped between the desperate yearning for instant validation and the crushing fear of absolute public humiliation. This manufactured digital landscape perfectly exploits our deepest psychological vulnerabilities, leaving us feeling chronically empty and profoundly anxious. Our conscious identity is systematically shredded by competing algorithms that understand the hidden architecture of our minds vastly better than we could ever possibly comprehend ourselves. This eternal internal conflict also brilliantly explains why romantic relationships are frequently fraught with unexplainable drama and sudden heartbreak. When two individuals attempt to build a life together, it is never merely a union of two conscious minds. It is a highly volatile collision of 6 distinct psychological factions. Your desperate id clashes secretly with their rigid superego, creating invisible misunderstandings that completely defy all forms of rational communication. To achieve any measure of authentic peace, we must finally relinquish the delusional goal of achieving total psychological purity. The objective of psychoanalysis is not to destroy the savage id nor to completely silence the demanding superego. True maturity requires acknowledging the endless conflict and cultivating an extremely resilient ego capable of navigating the chaos without succumbing to blind panic or falling into the comforting traps of neurotic denial. Understanding this brutal tripartite structure is absolutely crucial for achieving genuine human empathy and lasting psychological liberation. We must stop judging ourselves as fundamentally broken simply because we experience powerful conflicting desires. These internal contradictions are not unforgivable errors or signs of irredeemable weakness. They are the universal defining characteristics of the human experience. The heaviest exhaustion comes from the invisible battles we continually fight against our own nature. The ghost of the child forever haunts the architecture of the adult mind. Chapter 5. The Shadows of Childhood. Why do we carry certain irrational fears or bizarre behavioral patterns into our adult lives? We believe that growing up automatically erases the vulnerabilities of our youth. However, Freud revealed a deeply unsettling truth about human development. We do not simply outgrow our childhoods. We meticulously build our entire adult personalities directly on top of those incredibly fragile early foundations. During the earliest stages of our existence, we are completely powerless and entirely dependent upon our caregivers. Every single interaction with our parents leaves an indelible and permanent mark upon our developing psyche. Freud proposed that human beings pass through highly specific psychological stages of development. If we experience severe frustration or excessive indulgence during any phase, our emotional growth becomes permanently arrested. He described these arrested developments as psychological fixations. Consider the adult who exhibits extreme stubbornness, obsessive cleanliness, and a terrifying need for absolute control. While society might label them as a perfectionist, psychoanalysis views them as being psychologically stuck in an early battle for bodily autonomy. Their rigid adult behavior is simply a desperate continuation of a forgotten childhood power struggle. Alternatively, observe the individual who constantly demands endless attention, experiences chronic dependency in relationships, and desperately seeks external validation. They are not merely clingy, they are echoing a profound early deprivation. They are still subconsciously attempting to extract the unconditional love and absolute security that they were tragically denied during the most vulnerable and formative years of their utterly helpless infancy. We falsely believe that we choose our romantic partners based upon rational compatibility and shared values. Yet, the unconscious mind is actually driving the selection process. We continually seek out individuals who resemble the emotional blueprints established by our parents. We desperately attempt to recreate the exact same dysfunctional dynamics of our youth, hoping to finally achieve a triumphant and healing resolution. This unconscious compulsion explains why so many intelligent individuals repeatedly sabotage their own happiness by entering abusive or neglectful relationships. They are not consciously choosing to suffer. They are blindly following a deeply ingrained psychological script written long before they ever had the conscious power to object. The child within continues to relentlessly seek the familiar, even when the familiar is absolute agony. The heaviest chains we wear were forged before we even knew how to speak. True awakening always begins at the exact moment we stop fleeing from our deepest pain. Chapter 6. The Agony of Awakening. If the human mind is a complex architecture of hidden traumas and suppressed desires, how can we possibly begin the terrifying process of healing? Modern society relentlessly encourages us to simply move forward, to forget the past, and to drown our anxieties in endless distractions. However, psychoanalysis proposes a brutally different approach. It demands that we stop running and finally turn around to face the pursuing monsters. We fundamentally misunderstand the true nature of psychological trauma. The ultimate trauma is not necessarily the violent or dramatic event itself, but rather the deep, invisible emotional rupture that occurs when our pain is entirely ignored and unvalidated. It is the suffocating loneliness of crying out for help and receiving absolutely no response from the surrounding world. That crushing isolation becomes permanently etched into the unconscious. When we desperately attempt to ignore these unhealed wounds, we do not erase them. We merely grant them absolute control over our destiny. The suppressed pain secretly manipulates our daily choices, our romantic relationships, and our sudden bursts of inexplicable anger. We transform into highly functional machines, capable of surviving the daily modern grind, but entirely incapable of genuinely experiencing the beautiful depths of authentic human existence. True psychological healing is never a comfortable or peaceful journey. It is a violent and agonizing excavation of the soul. You cannot cure an infected wound by simply covering it with a clean bandage. You must courageously reopen the flesh and drain the poison. Similarly, you must willingly re-enter the terrifying memories and finally allow yourself to fully feel the devastating emotions that you previously repressed for survival. The first crucial step toward genuine liberation requires developing a fierce and unforgiving self-awareness. We must begin meticulously recording every single moment that triggers an irrational or overwhelming emotional response within us. By bravely writing down our darkest thoughts without any filter or shame, we establish a vital bridge between our conscious intellect and the hidden turmoil, boiling violently beneath the surface of our awareness. We must also learn to actively dialogue with our own suffering. Instead of numbing the pain with endless entertainment, we should close our eyes and gently invite the trauma to step forward. We must ask the scared inner child what it desperately needs to feel safe. This internal conversation slowly dismantles the tyranny of the repressed memory, transforming a terrifying ghost into a manageable emotional experience. The ultimate goal of this exhausting psychological excavation is not to erase the past or achieve an impossible state of flawless perfection. True healing means reclaiming the fragmented pieces of your shattered soul and reintegrating them into a complete, resilient whole. We must forge a new identity that acknowledges the profound scars, without allowing those very scars to continually dictate the absolute limits of our future happiness. We can only truly rescue ourselves when we finally possess the courage to bleed consciously. The ultimate rebellion, in a modern world defined by endless distraction, is the absolute courage to look inward. Chapter 7. The Courage to Know Thyself. We live in a brackingly fast-paced digital era that relentlessly encourages absolute psychological numbness. We are constantly surrounded by glowing screens and endless streams of shallow entertainment designed exclusively to keep our conscious minds completely occupied. Society desperately wants us to keep moving forward rapidly because pausing might force us to finally confront the terrifying silence residing deep within our own hollow souls. When Sigmund Freud first published his revolutionary theories over a century ago, he completely destroyed the grand illusion of human arrogance. Before his monumental discoveries, we proudly believed that we were the absolute rational masters of our own biological destinies. He proved that we are not even the masters of our own minds, permanently demoting human consciousness from a supreme dictator to a desperate mediator. This devastating realization remains just as profoundly disruptive today as it was during the stuffy Victorian era. We still desperately try to treat our deep psychological wounds with superficial slogans and empty motivational quotes. We swallow chemical prescriptions and attend quick wellness retreats, hoping to magically erase years of deep-rooted trauma without ever actually having to endure the agonizing pain of genuine self-reflection. Psychoanalysis was never intended to serve as a simple magical cure for all human suffering. It does not promise a fairy tale ending, where you magically achieve a state of perpetual joy and unshakable peace. Instead, it offers something vastly more authentic and ultimately more valuable. It provides a beautifully tragic but completely honest map of the incredibly complex and often dark human condition. To truly understand ourselves, we must willingly embrace the absolute chaos that churns violently beneath our carefully constructed social personas. We must accept that we are fundamentally flawed creatures, driven by selfish desires, haunted by forgotten childhood ghosts, and constantly tormented by impossible moral standards. Perfection is a cruel myth invented by the superego to ensure that we remain perpetually exhausted and deeply ashamed. Freud brilliantly argued that the entire concept of modern civilization is built upon the massive suppression of human instincts. We surrendered our primal freedom and our savage desires in strict exchange for the comforting security of laws and social order. However, this grand societal bargain demands a continuous and agonizing sacrifice of our truest biological nature, creating a pervasive background anxiety within every modern citizen. This constant societal repression explains why humanity periodically erupts into apocalyptic global violence and catastrophic wars. The collective unconscious of a nation can only suppress its aggressive primal urges for so long before the pressure becomes absolutely unbearable. When the fragile diplomatic defenses finally collapse, the repressed savage id of millions bleeds into reality, transforming cultured civilizations into terrifying theaters of unimaginable mass slaughter. We are therefore entrusted with a monumental individual responsibility to analyze our own darkest impulses before they poison the collective waters. Every single person who courageously commits to healing their own deepest childhood wounds actively prevents that toxic generational trauma from infecting their innocent children. Doing the agonizing work of psychological self-discovery is the most profound act of love you can offer humanity. Do not despair. When you uncover the selfish or terrifying urges lurking within your own mental labyrinth, the objective is not to eradicate the darkness, for that is mathematically impossible, but to learn how to masterfully dance with your own shadows. A truly sovereign individual is one who hears the deafening roar of the unconscious beast, yet consciously chooses to respond with calm compassion. When we finally relinquish the exhausting need to appear completely flawless, we experience a Bretter King surge of genuine freedom. Recognizing our own hidden traumas allows us to look upon the brokenness of others with profound empathy rather than harsh judgment. We realize that the arrogant boss, the bitter neighbor, and the flawed parent are all secretly fighting their own invisible and terrifying psychological battles. We must stop viewing our symptoms, our anxieties, and our depressions as signs of fundamental weakness or irredeemable failure. These painful experiences are the urgent whispers of a soul desperately trying to heal itself by forcing the conscious mind to pay attention to the ignored darkness. Your pain is not your enemy. It is the most honest and loyal messenger you will ever encounter. The journey into the unconscious is the ultimate adventure of human existence, far more dangerous and magnificent than exploring the deepest oceans or the furthest stars. It requires the absolute courage to stand naked before your own psychological mirror without flinching. You must willingly dismantle the comforting lies you have told yourself for decades and slowly rebuild a life founded upon absolute radical truth. Thank you for joining me on this exhaustive and deeply reflective journey through the hidden architecture of the human mind. If this immersive exploration has helped you see beyond the illusion of your own rationality, please like this video and subscribe to my philosophy channel. Join our growing community as we continue to dive deeply into the hidden structures governing human behavior and society. If your unconscious mind has been quietly orchestrating your entire life from the shadows, do you truly know who is making your choices?